Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Erik Davis, continuing our conversations about the cultures of consciousness. Speaking of cultures of consciousness, I've stayed up late last night on Netflix watching the new Errol Morris documentary Wormwood, which is about the fabled likely murder of Dr. Frank Olson in the early 1950s after he had been dosed without his knowledge by LSD by some of his CIA compatriots. And it's not only a fascinating historical study of the times and of the various things that have happened over the era as we learn more about MK Ultra and other kinds of mind control programs and CIA nastiness, but it's a fascinating study of what happens to consciousness, what happens to personality when you dive into the labyrinth of mirrors around intelligence agencies, issues of mind control, lying, and it's a brilliant, brilliant documentary. It involves collage. It weaves ideas of Hamlet woven through. It's also kind of a meditation on what does it mean to know too much or too little. I don't usually start out the show with mentioning reviews, but I think I might do it a little bit more because there's a lot of stuff that comes across my desk that I really think people should pay attention to. And so check out Wormwood by Errol Morris on Netflix. Luckily today we have a much more pleasant story about the intersection of science, consciousness, and contemporary culture. Bruce Dahmer is a good friend of mine. I've known him for many years, and most of the time I see Bruce, it's at a party or a festival, and he's definitely one of the most liveliest dressed people around, like some kind of time-traveling Alice in Wonderland wizard with amazing brocade coats and always fascinating headgear. He's quite a wild character. He's a long time burner and a classic OG freak geek, Bay Area freak geek, crossing those two worlds as he works as a computer scientist. He did early work on computer interfaces and virtual worlds. As a scientist, he's worked for NASA, so he's the real deal, but he's also a real freak, and it made his recent explorations even more interesting to me because it's something that combines interests that he's had throughout his life with some real breakthrough science. And what we'll be talking about is what some people are calling a Copernican revolution in our ideas about the origins of life on the planet inside, of course, the scientific framework. And just the stuff we'll be talking about was recently on the cover of Scientific American in August of last year. Fascinating article that talks about Bruce's work as part of a larger team of a growing number of people who are interested in a new model of where life came from. So, with no further ado, Bruce, welcome to Expanding Mind.
Thank you, Erik. And by the way, along with one of my favorite miniseries, which is Vikings, they depict my ancestors, because the pronunciation of my last name is actually Damer, of the sea. And it was the Vikings who invaded northern France and then moved into England. So the Anglified version is Damer, but the Frankish version is Damer. And it was wonderful to hear actors actually speaking Frankish in that Viking series.
Yeah, I liked Vikings, but I managed to produce neither of those two pronunciations. So I might go with Damer because it has that nice lilt to it, and I never thought about the phrase "from the sea," which is kind of ironic given our topic of conversation, because the conventional model of the origins of life is that it's Damer, it's from the sea. And one of that's one of the apple carts you guys are upsetting with your new views. So maybe just to take a little bit, a little step back, what is the more conventional view, or at least over the last few decades, about the origins of life, and then what's the kind of baseline radical shift of the model you guys have been coming up with?
Yeah, actually, the originator of thinking about the origin of life is actually Charles Darwin. In a letter in 1871, he talked about some warm little pond somewhere full of phosphoric salts and electricity, and such that a protein compound should form and become more complex. And he actually nailed it. That's the actual way we believe life began. And since 1871, our field went down several rabbit holes. First, there was the sort of primordial soup of Oparin and Haldane, and then there was the spark chamber experiments of Miller and Urey, which were interesting but actually off track in the, they got the atmosphere wrong. But that started our field, that sparked our field, and then in the late 70s, a exploration team found these black smokers at the bottom of the Pacific in that case, and somebody casually mentioned that maybe life could start there. But the chemists, so because it's a great big broiling system of chemicals and some energy gradients and whatnot, and the chemists never liked that. The chemists were like, well, we would never be able to do our chemistry in those conditions for the fragile early phases of polymerization in life's little protocells. So Dave Deemer, my scientific mentor and partner, you always need mentors, don't you? And he discovered a system in the 90s that if you dry little pools down in the presence of membranes and lipids, they squeeze these little building blocks together, amino acids and the nucleic acids, and then they can actually make the building blocks of life without having life. So it solved this amazing conundrum that nature couldn't, make its own building blocks because it didn't have the tools, but there was a natural tool, which is the cycling pool.
Well, that seems the really the core of it. I remember when you were talking when you first started to talk about this stuff with me, I was like, what? What's the big deal? So what? So it's a sea vent or it's a pool? But it's this idea of cycling, that the notion of cycling of as these pools, become more wet, as they dry out, as they get moist, as they get wet again, and they move through this cycling pattern. It creates the kind of laboratory, if you will, almost for a sort of endless series of natural experiments, some of which can bring these materials together in a way, hypothetically, that could provide all the building blocks for life. So where did talk about the cycle, because that seems to be the sort of the key of the vision.
Yeah, this cycle idea. This is why somebody at a conference last year raised their hand and said, "This is a kind of new Copernican revolution." And I asked why, and he said, "Because you may have discovered the cycling system, that as it turns, it creates everything." Because in a sense, this cycling system that initially turned through wet-dry is driven by the rotation of the planet and the orbit of our Earth around the sun. So the sun comes up and bathes the land in energy and cycles energy through it and dehydrates. So that's a physical cycling engine. We sort of call it like an engine of creation or a Genesis engine. But it turns out that everything is spun out of that cycle, including all of evolutionary biology, all the way up into even culture, technology, and possibly even models for consciousness are driven by this tripartite. I call it a tripartite cycling engine. And I've recently been presenting at conferences on consciousness, the Science of Consciousness Conference and the Science and Non-Duality Conference. And because of this Copernican challenge, the person says, "Have you found a new center?" I've been doing a lot of thought experiments and come up with a general plan or a general code for the cycling system. And I'm challenging those communities, find anything that's not explainable by a cycle of these three properties.
Well, that's I mean, I really want to get to that stuff, and I've seen your lectures on and trying and tying these things to culture and to consciousness, and the whole way that this offers sort of a different kind of systems theory, in the sense that it's describing abstractly a system of this three-stage cycling, but it seems to be able to apply to many different domains of reality and at different levels of scale and time. So it's fascinating. But staying with the evolutionary biology model, what are we talking about when we talk about the cycles in these early hot springs 3 billion years ago, bubbling away on the Earth's surface? What is the what does the cycling do? What are its phases?
Well, here's how it works. Say if you were to go in your hot tub or jacuzzi or a hot spring and you put some bubble bath solution in. So you had a nice bubbly jacuzzi. And then the jacuzzi sort of drained and dried down. The bubble bath solution would make the bubbles more stable and there'd be a mass of them at the bottom. But then eventually they'd dry out and form a layer called a bathtub ring, that you can see in any cycling system of hot water. And between those layers, between that little slick film, is the chemical factory, the miracle of nature's stitching together of trillions upon trillions of polymers of RNA, peptides, which are your protoproteins, and possibly even self-assembling DNA. So what you've got then in your dry little jacuzzi is this massive random sequence library. And then when the jacuzzi fills back up, these random sequences get trapped in bubbles, which we call protocells, which then float into the solution. And most of them just pop, bubbles pop. But the ones that are stabilized by a random choice of the combination of these molecules, they're stable, so they end up coming back down. They're like bubble bath solution. And then they deliver the contents of that random sequence back for another go-round. And those random things are no longer random. They do a job. They stabilize their protocell, and so they may get sequenced again and produced again. And we see this now chemically in the lab. We can actually do this in a few hours of cycling. And we recently did it in a hot spring environment out in the field in a volcanic hot spring.
And it holds up. So it's sort of like you get a kind of well, I mean, cycling is obviously the word, but it's allowed to sort of feed on itself, and it gives you the engine, the dynamic thing that's pushing it through time. So it's not just throwing a bunch of elements inside of a pool, and somehow or another they eventually smash up into each other. It's that the cycling that the pool itself is going through creates almost like a petri dish that has memory, because it's able to sustain some of its discoveries from previous cycles and build upon them over time.
Yeah, you've nailed it, Erik, because what the pool gives you, the protocells give you a miraculous, almost seemingly miraculous property called probability tweaking. So because the polymers are in their little bubbles, they're more likely to get together. They're more likely to react and do things. That's what your body and all of nature does. It crowds things together to increase the probability of things happening. And then when the protocells are all themselves together in the little sludge, we call it a gel or a progenote, they start messaging each other. So one thing happening in one protocell gets distributed to other ones. And the third thing, and you've just identified as that, is on top of that system of probability increasing and message trafficking, you can get the emergence of a memory system. So you get these little templates that will emerge, we predict, that actually are the first genetic genotype type response. And then the system now, in a sense, knows itself, not in a conscious way, but it can carry forward the experiments with a previous understanding or a previous recording or coding. and it lifts the living world into being. And this is still how the living world rolls. And I might put it to the listeners, also culture, technology, and everything else. It uses these three things in tandem.
Well, how do you define the three things? When you talk about three things, could you just say them just like the specific names for them?
So a probability engine that it takes things that are unlikely and gradually makes them more likely and makes them then actual. So that's one process. And then message passing, communications, control sequences, in case language. And then the third is a memory, a recording of what was done on the last round.
You know what's fascinating about it when just to hear you describe this process, it's like there's a sort of geochemical and biological, proto-biological language going on of, material molecules, things we know, lipids, peptides, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, it sounds like you're describing a kind of a sort of abstract, almost a sort of virtual system you might set up in a computer, that there's a kind of computer logic to it, whether it's this notion of booting up, the idea, you can set all these processes in motion and then it creates this larger systemic effect, or even just the attention to cycles and innovation. In the article on the Scientific American, they describe these as innovation pools. And it's such a contemporary metaphor, for the way that we're understanding innovation in a human sense, or in technological sense, or a post-human sense, to be frank, where we're almost like we're analyzing what are the conditions necessary to create dynamic possibilities and to have them actually get their feet on the ground and start to change reality. And it's sort of like I get the sense of almost like a kind of breakdown between disciplines, between geology and biology and computer science and systems theory. It's quite a rich way of talking about these things.
Yeah, and in my recent, I had lunch with Jeffrey Kripal, who you know very well, so very well, in at Rice University. We were talking about this, and I was saying, is this a centering? Can you, for instance, the reason why AIs have been so crippled in the last, all attempts to build AIs are really attempts to build fast table lookup algorithms, right? AIs generally, unless they're using some kind of neural network system, they can learn a little bit, but they don't get that far, and they're very specialized and they're very breakable. And so one of the things I was talking about with Jeff was this idea is an idea for an open-ended system of creativity, of innovation, as you pointed out, because it boots up from scratch, and it boots up from a very noisy environment, and it surfs that noise. It surfs the second law of thermodynamics to boot itself up and staying ever ahead of degradation by reinvention. And ultimately, we will be able to build AIs that use the power of evolution. They will take a lot more processing power. There will be slower growers, but they will be the true open-ended learning system that all of sci-fi and, Jeff's studies point to people being afraid of the blob, but we're nowhere near making a blob as yet.
So are you saying that a lot we hear so much about AI now, it's in the mainstream media and people are worried about it and this and that, and there's a lot to say about that. I don't want to get completely off base, but I'm also interested in your ideas here. Is it the idea that in a way we ain't seen nothing yet, like that a lot of the machine learning and these sort of using huge databases in order to find patterns and use those patterns in order to extrapolate or whatever is actually not as interesting as what might happen when the kind of cycling process that you're describing is manifested in code or in digital environments?
Yeah, I think that future generations are going to look back at people like Ray Kurzweil, sorry to say, people with all these pronouncements, they're going to laugh at us because it's very much like us looking at the author of Frankenstein saying it's laughable that a system made out of pistons, could get up and walk like a man and, have emotional crises and express irony. We laugh at that. We laugh at visions of 1930s, War of the Worlds type technology, which was based on not even transistors. I mean, it was all sort of clunky 1930s style electronics, and I think that the future generations are going to laugh at us believing that our primitive, single pipe serial processing computing systems could actually do anything other than become faster widgets, specialized widgets. So it will take a complete role in computer science to realize how limited the capacities of current architectures are for really doing the real thing that nature does all the time.
And talk a little bit about the, booting up. It's such a fascinating concept, like emerging from computer science, but also kind of suggesting a worldview or a world of possibilities where you just get enough things moving and other things emerge. And whether we think, we go to the big level and we think of that perhaps consciousness is really just being booted up by certain processes in the brain, if you believe that it's an emergent property, but also in our own lives and how societies operate. It's counterintuitive in a way, and yet we see examples of it all the time. And it seems like your cycling process is in a way almost one of the ultimate examples of a booting up process.
When I was invited by Stuart Hameroff to come and deliver a plenary at his conference it's called The Science of Consciousness, I thought, what am I doing there? I've not read I know nothing about consciousness. I don't even know if I have it, So I did a thought experiment where I asked, do you need consciousness or something like it present at the origin of life to, like a guy in a white beard with a big staff that says, move that carbon atom 5 angstroms to the left, an organizing principle. And in this dream, the voice came into the dream saying, no, that's an unnecessary complication. Let me show you how you were made. And it showed me this triangle. It showed me just through demonstration of the first protocell in the undulating plane of predictable physics, changing probability. And then it showed another protocell next to it, and communications across the membrane. And then it showed a mass of protocells, and it said, what do you see? And I said, well, it's like a nonlinear exploding network. And it said, yes, it outruns reality. It outruns physics. Now what comes next, it asked. And I said, some kind of memory? And it said, bingo, and showed me informational polymers. And then the whole thing is a Cartesian plot running, and then the three system thing going. And it said, this thing winds up and builds something very large, even in the Progenean, even in the era before the cells divide. Right, in the earliest phases of life, this system becomes huge. It creates something called the field. And you monkeys are instruments into the field, but you have your filters and your biases. So you only see little fragments or feel little fragments of it. So don't name it. Don't assume that you know it. Just experience it. Just grow into it. Don't predicate it in any way. You're just coming into awareness of it. So perhaps that is a story way of addressing what you were talking about, how consciousness might emerge out of this tripartite system.
Yeah, well, it's funny. I mean, I've spoken to you many times before. I've had you on the show before, and I know that you have an unusual imagination. You have an unusual consciousness, and so when you describe the story you just gave us about having this thought experiment, and then it turns into a kind of dialogic kind of reaction, and you're sort of seeing answers to your questions. this sounds to me something, as much like a psychedelic vision as a traditional, Gedanken experiments, where it's somewhere between physics and a kind of visionary process. So when you describe that kind of that particular question you asked and those set of answers that you were getting, is that something you kind of like just get going in your own mind? Is it that you find that there's a kind of answering, that some of these deep questions get answered for you in sort of almost a visionary register, if you will?
Yeah, I found since I started this practice around when I was about 9 years old, and I realized there's like two ways of doing things. One is to try to figure out the world, and my little realmy mind would go out into the world and realize it's just too complex to actually work out what to do, where to walk on the street from rational processes. So I decided to just use an intuitive barometer that was always running inside me. And so that became my guide. And that actually guided me into visionary states. When I was 9, I would lie in my bed underneath my brother. We were in a bunk, and he was up above, and I would just see all these flashes in front of my closed eyelids, and I would dial my consciousness back. I'd dial my thinking mind back far enough that the flashes would turn into worlds. They were color TV, and we didn't have a color TV. Didn't even have a black and white TV, I don't think. But so that I coupled this idea of doing things through intuition and just waiting for messages to come with this visionary sort of render farm, and drew thousands of pictures of worlds in my teen years, and then used that dialing in, TV mechanism in my virtual worlds work and the spacecraft work, coding work, and now the origin of life. So it is like a Gedanken experiment. It's like Einstein running alongside the beam of light, or Crick's visions, or all of these scientific mystics seem to use this space or these tools, and I was fortunate enough to make that decision early on, and then just refine and dial in the tools.
Yeah, it's remarkable about learning to trust intuition. It's funny for me is that I'm much more conscious of it now, and that I was lucky in that a lot of my thoughts, usually my intuitions, are about other people, about cultures, about ideas, about places, about the forces that are dominating a given situation, less scientific than yours, although you also have that other stuff. But in retrospect, I realized that a lot of the things that I did, a lot of what made me a good journalist, a lot of what made me have a lot of really interesting friends, was that I was actually allowing my intuition to make decisions, but I wasn't necessarily that aware of it. And as I've gotten older, I've become more aware of it, even to the point of view of turning to it, like in the midst of sometimes challenging situations, and going, okay, I'm not going to reason my way out of this one. This intuition stuff's been working pretty well, so let's go with it. That way of using that, even with these complicated scientific questions that you're asking about, is really remarkable. When did you first start asking questions about the origin of life? When did that become one of the things that you were, gedonkening?
Gedonkening. Well, it was a specific day in the spring of 1976, and I was 14. I'd turned 14. And I was walking out in the sagebrush hills around Kamloops, British Columbia, Canada. Yay, Canada, the great pink north. And a flower was coming up through the just frozen ground. And it was a Mariposa lily, and they were my favorite flowers. And it just was unfolding into this fantastic tripartite, 3-part. Lilies generally are that way. And I said to myself, my mind asked, well, this obviously came from a bulb or a seed. There was a simpler structure, and it unwound into this complex structure. So there's some kind of instructions. I didn't know about code, and we didn't have computers in our town. And then I stood up and realized all of these plants come from this instruction thing. And there had to have been, and then my mind went back through time searching for, there had to have been a first seed. There had to have been a single one. Then I stood up and started walking up the hill and realized, wait a minute, that first seed had to be made out of parts. Unless you believed in a God, an all-seeing God, ordering stuff from the Sears catalog, that all-seeing, not being an all-seeing God, there had to be parts that just fell together and then self-assembled into the first code. And I thought, well, this is not possible. And then I recalled that Albert Einstein did these thought experiments. And I thought, well, this is the coolest thing to even think about for a nerdy kid. I'm going to work on this for 90 years. I remember that figure. This is going to be my entire life if I live long. I'm going to work on it all my life because it's so interesting. And suddenly there was this bundle of molecules in the air in my third eye. I didn't know what a third eye was, and I saw it and I thought, oh, it's a thought experiment. It's come as a result. It's my first one. And I was about to ask it the question, how did you self-assemble? I mean, show me the pieces coming together, like Lego, or Meccano that you would use as a 14-year-old. And it then turned to me and asked me a question, saying, figure out how I made a copy of myself. And then my little brain went to an automobile factory saying, well, machines need big machines to make copies of them, like a car needs a factory. And I don't see a bigger machine around you, so that's implausible. And it winked. It winked at me and said, work on it. And in 2013, I saw the system. I saw how this actually went down chemically. I had another visionary, and nothing more than after yoga and breath work one morning, I just fell into this reverie, and I saw the cycling system we just talked about and realized it was small machines working in concert in a network that lifted the big machine into being.
What's great about when I hear about the visionary dimension of what you're talking about and this kind of intuitive flashes and even this sort of dialogue with the mystery that is able to articulate itself and lead you on and even kind of play with you a little bit. When you think about those kinds of your kind of direct experience with that domain inside the history of science, people generally think about kooks, like, oh, they have this crazy visions and then they come up with a 0-point energy machine or whatever, Whereas our typical image of scientists, even if we know about Einstein's thought experiments, et cetera, our typical image of scientists is they're much more by the book. They're not really looking at the imagination. They're not doing yoga and then trying to talk to the other world. So one of the things that's always blown me away is that I know you in the context of, visionary culture and Burning Man and crazy ideas, and Terence McKenna. We're both, deeply marked by our friendship with Terence. But then you also operate in these worlds that are just full of hardcore scientists who are concerned about their appearance, don't want to have anything to do with visionary yoga or anything like that. So how do you interface with that world? How when you had these kind of these senses, this sort of download about cycling processes, what did you do then? Did you reach out and talk to people who are working in similar fields? How did you kind of build momentum around this process? Because it's now there's tons of people involved in it, but how did you kind of go with this stuff? And I'm just kind of curious how you show up to these people, if you know what I mean.
Oh, well, I do something I call reskinning. So I have a practice that we sort of call realm bending, and I started this when I was a teenager too. I wanted to get inside the skin of others. I wanted to simulate other people, to see their point of view, and I became pretty good at it. I felt that the greatest thing you could do is be an empath and become the other, so that you completely saw their world, because then you could grok their reality, and you could then network it all with other realities, and you could create a meta meta understanding that would help shift entire things. So I've been doing this for 35 years. Did it in, the super nerdy world of IT software, and did it in at NASA, did it in anthropology, did it in the festival culture to some degree. But what happens, say, for instance, if you have a visionary idea, and this is a kind of a guide for people out there, if you have a visionary idea about something, and then you just stick with the vision and you don't test it, you don't go to an expert, you don't get it dialed in, and you just stick with it, then you're attaching to a story that will take you down a rabbit hole. Terence had this 2012 eschaton thing that took him down the rabbit hole. It paid the bills, but it was really nonsense, And so if you have a vision and you find an expert that helps you dial it in, and in my case, it was David Deemer at UC Santa Cruz, a world-renowned biophysicist or membrane physicist, physical chemist. But then you get it tested against the metal of the field. Otherwise, it's just going to be go into the spinning into the world of story, and you become that person. So, over the years, I just became those people. I could speak their language. I read all the papers. I went to all the conferences. I ended up running parts of all their conferences. Now I'm part of the organization that works on Origin of Life. But I was just in Galveston, Texas, with 150 of these very reductionist, dialed-in chemists. And so while I'm there, I am them. I'm co-chairing their meeting and introducing the people, and then I'm talking to everyone to create a grand synthesis now. But it's just, you just allow you put yourself on the shelf, and you just allow yourself to absorb into another culture, and they'll accept you. They'll take you in as their own. There's a few mutants in there. There's a few freaks in there, and occasionally you'll connect with them, the people that use thought experiments and whatnot. And truthfully, many of the dialed-in bench scientists, they know that they're just doing technician work, right? They know that they need a mystic to enter their field, like Francis Crick, and give them the structure of DNA. They're kind of waiting around for that madman or madwoman to show up to allow the breakthrough to happen, and they grudgingly accept them, and give them Nobel Prizes and things on occasion. So, if science did not have the mystics or the mutants, it would just grind itself up in technical work and just adding dots to eyes and adding stuff to bibliography, so it wouldn't have the big breakthroughs.
This is reminding me very much of one of my favorite books about the history of science. Kaiser's book, How the Hippies Saved Physics. Have you read that, Bruce?
I've read around in it. I actually see Nick Herbert once
Yeah.
a week, so he's part of that cadre.
Oh, definitely. I got to meet Nick finally at a Robert Anton Wilson event in Santa Cruz last year. It was really, really wonderful. Anyway, it's just a fascinating book because he's making he's a scientist and a historian of science, and he's saying, look, when all these psychedelic physicists in the early 1970s who were interested in the paranormal and consciousness, but were also real trained physicists, when they started thinking all these crazy possibilities about entanglement, about information travel and time, and some of their ideas went too far. Some of them were rabbit holes, as you point out. But that even the rabbit holes drove questions that then more conventional science had to deal with, at least to say why they were wrong, and some of them were, but in so doing, it enlivened the whole field. And it's a fascinating, I never really thought about it, because you think about there's the mad visionary and some of their ideas are true and maybe that other people pick up on it, and some of them are crazy and nobody deals with it. But it's that the whole practice itself draws the field inevitably towards other questions that wouldn't have been asked if you didn't have the so-called mad visionary, which is
And
really a
yeah,
fascinating thing.
it's completely fascinating, and it's the growing boundary of human intellect, really. And in science, the good thing about science is it does have a mechanism to throw out the trash. There's so much, there's stuff that there are people who are not trained or qualified, who shouldn't be at meetings, who sometimes get in, but then they get pretty much, it's a self-correcting thing, unlike spiritual practices for the most part, or other parts of our culture. There's no self-correcting editing mechanism, and that's why I just love science. And going to these conferences on consciousness, you get there in the front row is Deepak Chopra, but there is a neuroscientist who's studying mirror neurons with fMRIs and stuff. So it's interesting, but I would actually, frankly, more rather talk to the scientists, because I know I'm not going to get babble. I'm going to get things that are grounded in knowledge, and that are more conservative,
Yeah,
despite the fact that I'm kind of one of these crazies in the sense, but I'm actually very conservative.
yeah, no, it's a wonderful balance, and from that perspective, we've mentioned Terence a couple times. I'd like to hear you talk about Terence from that perspective. And what I mean is that, on the one hand, Terence knew a reasonable amount about science, systems theory, biology. He was, a huge fan of Scientific American. He told me once, Scientific American, that's the most psychedelic publication out there. He was very interested in science, and he was also very skeptical. He was very skeptical about mystical claims, about gurus, about higher states of consciousness as the East understands it and stuff. So in many ways, he was a naturalist in his orientation, and yet at the same time, he was, of course, had all these crazy ideas, and those ideas may or may not have been important in the overall picture of things. I sometimes ask myself, did he need the time wave, which I always thought was bunk. From the moment I heard about it, it didn't smell good. I never enjoyed it. I was always annoyed when we went there, when hearing him talk and he'd get into the time wave. I'm like, this is just not, there's something interesting here, the way that the tarot is interesting. I mean, I like a lot of sort of whatever non-rational or quasi-rational, trans-rational systems of symbols and imagery and correspondences and association. That's part of the pleasure of supernatural thinking or magical thinking or participatory thinking, however you want to talk about it. That's cool stuff, but it ain't science. It's not telling us anything about what's going to happen in 2012. And but sometimes I wonder whether Terence needed that. He needed something that looked like an actual theory in order to motivate the rest of what he was doing, because somehow I don't know why. So I'd be curious, given these questions that we're talking about right now about science and visions and pulling discourses in different ways, and how you see Terence vis-a-vis the scientific imagination.
It went back to one particular day in the late 70s when I certainly didn't know Terence, but Terence and Dennis were at a scientific meeting. I think it was in Berkeley, and Dennis he's a scientist, and Dennis went through the training. He went that way. Terence at the time buttonholed a keynote speaker, and for an hour talked about the time wave. And this older professor was looking at this fuzzy-faced, intense, obviously intelligent, but was clearly misguided young man. And at the end of the hour, patiently said to him, "Young man, your theory is not only false, it's not even falsifiable." And so I think that was the moment where Terence left the dock, where his ship set sail. I think that he was bounced off of that pretty strongly. And I've talked about this with Dennis. There was that aura moment where Terence wanted to be accepted. He wanted to be in the academy. Of course, he ended up being an incredible scholar of Joyce and all these things, very much in the academy in some ways, even though as an outsider. So roll the clock forward. We're sitting in his house in 1999, where we had just sort of swapped roles. I had gone into his worlds the previous 2 weeks, and he had gone into my worlds. We had done a virtual worlds powwow from the house in Hawaii in avatar space, because that was a dream he had had, and we sort of made it come true. And then we were up half the night talking, and I said to Terence, Terence, are you really, you've got to be kidding about this eschatons and singularities and stuff, right? And in the back of my mind was seeing Terence sitting in front of his crappy Macintosh Quadra, or wherever it was, barely able to do email. And this man had never written a line of code. He doesn't understand technology. He's reading articles in Omni magazine and proclaiming that the eschaton is upon us and that it's going to be technical singularities, which of course, Ralph and Rupert had gotten pretty much fed up with that too. And I decided to explain to him the difference between a glass of water and his Macintosh. That a glass of water had a zillion, trillion things going on all at once, all probabilistic and stochastic, bouncing balls, bouncing ping pong balls. And that from that glass of water can emerge something as powerful and complex as the living world. Whereas his Macintosh is like an hourglass, taking grains of sand from the screen as he clicks on things, on the pixels, and funneling them down through a processor, the CPU, into the hard drive, and there's grains of sand piled up there, and the thing is clunky and fragile and completely underpowered, and that in fact the living world could never emerge. There would never be anything that would emerge that would have sort of self-awareness, let alone even the complexity of a slime mold inside digital architectures, especially the internet, which is even more clunky in terms of protocols and things. And at late at night, I think then it was at dawn or something, Terence turned to me, and because we were talking about Y2K, and I said, look, nothing's going to happen in Y2K, nothing at all. And Terence, I said, the thought was, do you really want to see a new age hippie Y2K in 2012 when none of this stuff makes any sense at all? And he said, well, I hope they don't take it all too literally. So there was the flip side of parents. But here's the interesting thing, Erik. Fuzzy-headed ideas like this, I resolved that night to say, well, Terence talks about, concrescence into novelty and how things complexify, but just sort of as a story, I'm going to actually go and track this thing down and figure out how it works. So it was my entire PhD work came to that, where we built the evolution grid that ran at UC San Diego for 7 months, grinding 30 cores into the ground, simulating that glass of water, trying to find out what happens when a bond forms, and then another one, and then another one. Why do the bonds after the first one form faster and faster? There's something going on. It's Stuart Kauffman's correlated universe. And the PhD actually showed it. We found the staircasing, hill climbing algorithm. I called it the cosmic wiggle. Terence talked about the cosmic giggle. We found the cosmic wiggle. It's stochastic hill climbing. This is how the universe complexifies against the degrading forces. And it goes straight into biology and uses the same freaking formula to complexify and make new things in evolution. So but that woolly-headed idea led to that. So
no, that's great. But where does the speed up happen? How does that? Is there a quickening of these processes over iterated as they iterate over time?
There, as far as I can tell, and this is my friends in complexity science basically told me, don't try to do the math. I'm not good at math, so that was good news to me. Neither was Terence, by the way. He said, do the simulations, simulate the soups, and see what you can find that emerges from them, what properties emerge. And so there is a quickening. There, what Stuart Kaufman, this correlated base function, that as soon as you get the first bond formed or the first relationship, the landscape goes from super random points, little jaggedy points of noise, and they start to develop ridges between the points. So it's like the Himalayas have foothills that have ridges that go up to the Himalayas. So you can climb a mountain because it's correlated, because there's ridges between peaks. Same thing in evolution. The finch's beak changes just a little, and then the finches find their way across that ridge and are able to crack the harder nut. This is Darwin's insight in the Galapagos, where I just was in November. I went to the Galapagos.
Oh, well, that sounds wonderful. Hey, so listen, we have about 7 minutes left, so I'm going to bring up an enormous other topic, which we mentioned earlier, and I wanted to make sure at least we can get a few words in, which is about consciousness. Now, as you said, you're not an expert in consciousness science and neuroscience. It's not stuff so you've spent a lot of time looking at, and you're also open at least to the kinds of really far out stuff that you would see at a science and non-duality conference or at Burning Man for that matter. So how do you see the topic of consciousness being illuminated by the cycling vision that you've come up with in terms of the origin of life?
Now that's a big one, and I'm actually doing a webinar starting on February 18th for SAND, 4 Sundays in a row. Here's a big plug on this very thing. How does consciousness get informed? And I think it's here's let's flip that in a way and say if we found cycling properties that booted up the living world and made this network, the primary mover of the living world is still that first property, P, probability. So the living world is rockingly good at manipulating probability and bringing improbable events into actuality. So from slimes of single-celled organisms, we suddenly have animals and plants, and we have an asteroid impact, and then we have different animals and plants. And it just keeps exploring space, and then it creates humans, and humans create these incredibly improbable things like a cell phone, which in the history of the cosmos, a cell phone emerging is like a stupendous thing. It's a one-time thing in the history of the freaking cosmos. And it's done by this probability lifting engine. And here's the pay dirt for everybody on the podcast. I think you can shape it mentally. I think that you can have a strong intention or an imagination or a dream, and you will shape valleys of probability ahead of you. And if you have that intention, somehow this field rolls little coins down into those valleys. And if you're going along like playing Doom and you pick up the objects, it then rolls open more valleys, and you keep going and going, and you're led to the most improbable, miraculous outcome in your life. And that is the greatest tool that human beings have and will ever have, because it's this power of intention and imagination and vision and clear sticking with it, like Einstein stuck with his theories, for 50 years. And it kept rolling, the coin kept rolling toward him. And then, of course, it was beyond him, the grand unified theory. But people who lead lives like this accomplish stupendous things, and they really shape the world, like the Steve Jobses of the world and whatnot. So I would say that consciousness is a field of intention that shapes probability, because that's the entire operating system core code of the living world, which this is consciousness emerges.
Wow, that's amazing stuff. And what I really like about it too is it's a very grounded version of a kind of geek freak optimism that I feel is in somewhat of a decline at our moment. There's a lot of grim things on the horizon, a lot of fear, and a lot of there's ways in which the kind of Bay Area technological, mystical counterculture that you and I both participated in, albeit in very different ways, has sort of facing some less pleasant outcomes of the kind of Silicon Valley ecosystem and what's done and doing to our world. And you've given us a good slice of a way of thinking about the role that consciousness and intention continue to play in the exploding probability space of our contemporary vertigo before the future. Are you? This is an utterly too simple question, but we just got a minute or so left. Are you, in this sense, an optimist?
In a sense, I hold a position that things are always unfolding and that there's continuous flow of astounding things. And if you say pay attention to too much noise in the news, or you get yourself depressed or anxious, you shake the field and you can't go forward, right? You're down a rabbit hole. But if you just pay no attention to any of that and just aim your sight on the horizon at that target, you'll pull reality in. And it really doesn't matter what else is going on. Bach wrote his cello concertos, and in Europe there was just absolutely ridiculous politics and bloodshed happening. So just, that's what we need. We need the function of people who are clear-eyed and looking at that beautiful eventuality and bringing it in.
Oh, that's good. Really, really good medicine for us at this moment, Bruce. You've mentioned your the upcoming webinar. Anything else that people might be looking at in terms of this origin of life stuff?
Yeah, all kinds of things are happening. We're forming an institute called the Biota Institute to fund all the investigators, the young investigators. I'm holding more regular meetings and brainstormings here. So people want to come to Ancient Oaks Farm. And I'm going to be putting a book together at some point after the grand theory paper is done this year. I'm going to synthesize the whole thing in a grand hypothesis with dozens of authors. But somewhere there's a book in this.
Wonderful. I look forward to all of that. Hey, Bruce, thanks so much for joining us on Expanding Mind.
Good to be back, Erik. Thank you.
All right, great. Folks, thanks for tuning in. Next week, we'll be talking to Jeff Warren about meditation and meditation for the rest of us. And till then, keep your minds open.